Welcome to the Eryri Podcast. I'm Rhiannon Jones, an officer with the LIFE Celtic Rainforests Project. This episode of the Eryri Podcast is a recording of a special project conference held at Bangor University at the end of April. Now in its 8th year, the LIFE Celtic Rainforests Project continues to celebrate its achievements, reflect on the lessons learnt, and look ahead to how this important work can continue through long-term partnerships and ambitious future goals. Firstly, we'll hear from David Jones, a project officer with Eryri National Park. David has spent the past 5 years leading invasive non-native species management across the national park. In his presentation, he explores the project's work tackling rhododendron ponticum, shares successes, challenges, case studies and insights into the scale and cost of this vital conservation work.
Good afternoon. I wanted to take you through a significant conservation challenge that we've been tackling, which is the management of invasive alien species, specifically rhododendron ponticum. For those of you working in forestry and woodland management, this species will be familiar. It's incredibly aggressive, it spreads rapidly, and it's already degraded thousands of hectares of our most valuable habitats. What we've learned over the past few years is that controlling it isn't just about treating it in isolation, but we need to address the problem from multiple angles simultaneously. By the end of my presentation, I hope you'll understand why this matters to the broader landscape and what tools we've developed to understand to help anyone tackle a similar challenge. I'll cover three main things: the project objectives, what we've actually achieved on the ground, and some of the operational challenges and lessons we've learned along the way. Firstly, the project was given three objectives in regards to invasive alien species management. These were labelled C1, C2 and C4. C1 involved the eradication of rhododendron ponticum across the 4 target special areas of conservation. C2 was the eradication of ponticum outside these SACs, but within a risk-based buffer zone. And this would be around 1 kilometre from the boundaries of the SAC. While C4 requires the targeting of other invasive species, such as Japanese knotweed and Montbretia, in areas where favourable condition of the target habitats is most threatened. This landscape scale approach was absolutely critical and emerged as a key lesson from our work. You can treat an entire SAC, but if you don't control the buffer areas, the whole landscape will recede in just a few years. Our target for C1 was to treat 973.8 hectares of SAC. C2, we were to target 6,987.4 hectares. Notice the ratio here. The buffer zone is nearly 7 times larger than the SAC work. And this reinforces my earlier point that to stop reinvasion, the peripheral areas are just as important. To date, we've actually commissioned work on 1,570.74 hectares of SAC and 8,634.55 hectares within the buffer zone. Besides the work we've done on the ground, we've also created the RP toolkit, which I'll cover a little bit more in detail later on. And we've also held demonstration and training events about invasive alien species management for 78 people. We've also produced 3 case studies on the management of invasive alien species. Managing invasive species at landscape scale isn't just an ecological problem, it's also been one with logistical and human resource problems. With over 400 contracts in place and more being commissioned, administration has been complex, with no 2 sites being the same. And we're only a small team, as Gethin said. The project only budgeted for 1 project officer within the original staffing structure, and we've had to adapt to bring in more staff. but hopefully this is a lesson learned for future projects which are just as ambitious. Our contractor pool is also quite small. Finding contractors with the appropriate skills and experience who understand the ecological requirements, who are willing to work in challenging conditions, has not been easy. This photo here was taken before treatment of a domestic garden. It's on the banks of the Mawddach estuary, and it was a well-established seed source. The deadwood was to be removed, and this presented an extra challenge because it was so dense. Access was really difficult, and it extended right to the cliff edge. And that brings me on to the next section, where I'm going to take you through a case study which goes into some detail about the differences in managing ponticum removal in domestic gardens versus open mountain pasture. So the photo in the top right is the garden from the previous slide after treatment. Much of the deadwood has been taken away for disposal, not just to make access to the remaining rhododendron easier, but also to allow sunlight to reach the floor, helping the natural regeneration of the site. Now, that wouldn't be a typical domestic garden. Domestic gardens are typically under half a hectare, easily accessible, and often only have isolated rhododendron bushes. And those bushes might well be planted intentionally or used as a privacy screen. The owner might also take pride in maintaining them, which means that resistance from the owners can be quite common. Whereas treatment of a mountain pasture will have steep, hazardous terrain with limited access and the need for rope access work in ravines, etc. The rhododendron could be present in several dense pockets and or dispersed across vast areas. Other factors like watercourses and managing public access also become more of a concern. If someone tells you that they need to remove your beautiful garden shrub, you're probably going to push back, especially if you've paid for it, it looks nice, and you've planted it yourself. That resistance is something that we've had to overcome regularly with domestic garden owners. Refusal to cooperate does happen, and those locations do jeopardise the success of landscape scale treatment. We found that domestic gardens also pose an administrative challenge as well. Managing several gardens throughout a village where you have to track down multiple owners, get the paperwork signed, negotiate timings, coordinate with the contractors, is genuinely harder than managing a single 100-hectare block. In comparison, mountain pastures tend to be more expensive to treat per hectare due to the often higher upfront costs involved. However, these costs are diluted when you increase the size of the area to be treated. We found that contractors have a hard time estimating costs on these vast sites, though. When tendering for multiple quotes, the range in prices we receive can be quite wide. This can also put the contract at a risk of cancellation, particularly during later phases of work where the contractor abandons the job and it's no longer worth their time and effort. We would expect a small garden under half a hectare to cost around £200–400 to do, potentially exceeding £2,500 though, if we need to include any remedial work, replanting with native trees, or revisiting again to remove deadwood. On an open mountain pasture, though, the cost per hectare can vary significantly. At the low end of £400 per hectare, you'd be looking at a large area using an established contractor who can work quickly. They might have their own welfare unit, or maybe they don't need it in this instance, and the rhododendron would be of a low density on level ground, doesn't need cutting back, and no rope access work would be required. At the higher end, £6,000 per hectare, it might sound huge, but this could involve smaller areas with dense infestations, maybe the hiring of mulchers or chippers and welfare units placed in remote areas, maybe a need for quad bikes and rope access work up and down ravines. What's really important here is the economies of scale. You could expect to put out 50 different contracts in domestic gardens, probably covering less than 25 hectares, at a cost of £800 per hectare, versus one large contract on over 25 hectares of open mountain, and that would cost half the price, £400 per hectare. This is why landscape scale targeting works better. The more area you put under one contract, the lower the cost per hectare. The critical connection between these two types of habitat is that one will always jeopardise the success of eradication in the other. You clear out rhododendron in, say, 500 hectares of mountain pasture, but leave a few gardens untreated, or treatment doesn't start for a few years. Seeds will drift from those gardens and reinfest the mountain pasture, and vice versa. Both battlefronts need to be targeted simultaneously for lasting success. These are some of the broader lessons that we've learned. First, that a multi-year commitment is essential. This isn't a single phase problem. You need to budget for at least 3 phases of work for a high kill rate. Secondly, early intervention is far cheaper. If you wait until stands are extensive, costs will rise and the seeds will have time to disperse further. Thirdly, landowner refusal isn't just frustrating, it can very quickly lead to reseeding of neighbouring habitats that have already been cleared. And finally, a partnership approach is critical. Bringing in public bodies, NGOs, communities, contractors to work together to operate at a full landscape scale rather than picking off isolated sites ad hoc. Looking ahead, the Afterlife Plan is being developed to set long-term priorities and identify potential funding streams so that this work doesn't end when the project does. We see real value in increasing homeowner education of invasives, and where appropriate would look into incentivising participation in control. We would also recommend looking into some sort of enforcement option, as Gethin has described previously, for cases where the landowner is unreachable or the land has been abandoned. Building a larger pool of suitably qualified contractors is another priority to increase capacity and resilience. Ultimately, the degradation of ecosystems due to invasive alien species can be catastrophic, so a collective response has to be equally ambitious. Finally, just a quick word on the RP toolkit itself. It's been developed as a comprehensive management guide that anyone can use. It includes a self-assessment protocols and density mapping, a detailed methodology covering 5 control techniques in a 3-phase treatment strategy, contractor qualification requirements and procurement advice, and we see it as a legacy resource that should make future projects across Wales and beyond faster to set up and more consistent in quality, without needing to reinvent the wheel. And this is available for free on the website.
Next, we'll hear from Ella Lewis from Coed Cadw and Adam Thorogood from Plant Life. Together, they discuss the project's ancient woodland restoration work, taking us through the restoration process, key successes and examples from sites including Corsagadol. Their presentation highlights the importance of restoring and reconnecting some of Wales's most valuable woodland habitats.
Hi everyone, I'm Ella and I work for Coed Cadw. and myself and Adam are going to take you through some of the work that was done on ancient woodland restoration within the project. So Action C7 for the project was to facilitate restoration of woodlands from conifers across target habitat and buffer zones. And the key target was to put 180 hectares of ancient woodland into active restoration. So the history of this threat goes back to the First World War, when increased requirements for fuel meant that mining operations were ramped up dramatically, creating a need for fast-growing timber to supply beams for mine shafts, especially here in Wales. Therefore, a large proportion of ancient woodlands were felled and replanted with these fast-growing conifer species, which we see today. The reason for this being such a key action for the project is that these conifer plantations don't form part of the rainforest ecosystem. They produce too much shade, they suppress the growth of native species, and they can't support the same rare native species that our rainforest broadleaves can. So the phased removal of conifers from these sites is absolutely key to improving the health of our rainforest ecosystem. You'll notice the target wasn't 180 hectares restored, but 180 hectares into restoration. This is because the process of restoration is ongoing and it can take decades for us to be able to classify it as restored. So to talk a little bit about the process for restoration, as I alluded to in the previous slide, restoration isn't a quick fix. The best practice for restoring ancient woodlands is to use a gradual approach over many years to increase light levels and allow natural regeneration without introducing more threats to the existing ancient woodland features. Planning management to prioritise the remnants of the ancient woodland is really key, like halo thinning, conifers around veteran trees, and protecting areas of ancient woodland ground flora which still remain. If changes are made too quickly, we can lose or damage these remnants, which is obviously the exact opposite of what we're trying to do when you're restoring an ancient woodland. But there is, of course, a need to balance the conservation outcomes with cost and practicalities of restoration. So not all methods will work on the same sites, and compromise is vital to getting an outcome that supports all the goals. So at the moment, the figure stands at 183 hectares, which has been put into restoration through the project. This was done through working with 12 landowners across 17 different sites in the project area. Of course, all sites are different, but most involved the removal of plantation trees, conifers, of course, but also broadleaves like beech, which aren't native to the rainforest here. So another important part, it wasn't just the capital works on the ground, but also showcasing to landowners and contractors the importance and opportunities for ancient woodland restoration. So we had 148 people attend these sessions across the duration of the project. And we also produced 3 case studies on sites which were worked on with the project, so others could learn from the successes and challenges faced. And I'm going to hand over to Adam now, who's going to walk through some of the case studies and challenges.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about a particular site that we worked on using the C7 budget from the project. But yeah, just to talk quickly about some of the challenges with some of the sites that are planted ancient woodlands. There's a high level of complexity with these sites, bringing them into management. Many of them haven't been managed for a long period of time. Many on really steep slopes with little access, and a lack of contractors who've worked in this sort of environment with these sort of challenges. But I'm going to talk about Coed Corsgedol. This is a 39-hectare ancient woodland, and Liz mentioned actually the Afon Ysgellin, Pont Ysgellin. The Afon Ysgellin runs down from the Rhinogydd, the mountain range that's just above this woodland, and it creates a fast-flowing stream, the Afon Ysgellin, which flows through this woodland, and it creates that high humidity that creates the conditions for temperate rainforest. So if you go for a walk in this woodland, it's a beautiful woodland to walk in. At the moment, wood anemones, bluebells are out in force. But it has an interesting history, like many of the woodlands that we worked on with this project. So in the 20th century, between the First and Second World Wars, most of the woodland was clear-felled, and the woodland was replanted after the Second World War with broadleaves, but with beech, with oak and ash. But it created a very even-aged plantation structure, and the temperate rainforest habitat in the understory really suffered as a result. So where the biodiversity, where the temperate rainforest assemblage of species hung on was close to the Afon-Ysgethyn, and that is still where you can find many of our important oceanic bryophytes, mosses and liverworts. So it's a really unique site. It's a SSSI, designated for its temperate rainforest species. It's part of the Meirionydd oak woods and bat sites, so it's one of these really important ancient woodlands that form part of the network across Meirionydd of our temperate rainforest. It's a really interesting site also because of its archaeological importance. Just above the site is a scheduled ancient monument, which is a dolmen, a burial site, and there's also a very well-defined Neolithic roundhouse above the site. But there's also Neolithic remains throughout the woodland. Because it's a woodland, these have never really been excavated, but they're still very, very important. So one of the things that NRW stipulated when we applied for a felling licence was that the heritage features, the historical environment within the site had to be foregrounded in the management. So alongside the temperate rainforest species, alongside these really important bryophytes and lichens, we had to think about the heritage environment as well. And so we had to work very closely with Gwynedd Archaeological Trust in order to, they carried out a watching brief, and NRW had specified also that the management should be carried out, the extraction should be carried out using low impact methods, hence we worked very closely with a horse logger in order to do this work. So the contract was actually a joint contract between a forestry contractor and a horse logger, and that worked really, really well. Yeah, there was lots of complexity with what we had to put in place before we were allowed to carry out the work. So as I said, it was a SSSI. It's a SSSI. The historical factors were paramount, and there had to be quite a lot of negotiation before we could actually carry out the felling licence, carry out the actions of the felling licence that we'd applied for. So it was a really good example of working with a group of different stakeholders, with really collaborative owners, the Bailey family, who've been living and managing Crossagedol Hall and the estate there for 3 generations. And yeah, we had a really good team with the project who worked together in order to make this happen, in order to bring this neglected woodland into management. Before we begun the work, you can see here there's examples of very even age structure. The plantation had been established, and the trees have grown up with a lot of side competition. It's very dense stand, and our aim really was to kind of bring some light into the understory, create some complexity in the woodland structure in order to try to manage the hotspots of temperate rainforest, in order to bring light to the stems of some of the more mature trees where our rainforest lichens grew and grow, and also to kind of provide a bit of light alongside some of the hydrological features, the streams where there's an increase in bryophyte diversity. So after the work took place, we can see light coming into the understory. We've started to get regeneration of oak. We've started to see a complexity in the structure being developed, and the site has gone into second stages of management. The owners are really up for more work happening, and continued to work with the contractor that we'd established a relationship with in the project. Also, the site has gone into the Woodland Improvement Grant and has become part of the National Forest for Wales. And I think that's largely a result of the the team we got together and through the project and the work that we carried out. So there's a new management plan that's been put together, and I think Cwicos y Gedol has been put on a really positive trajectory going forward as a result of the Celtic Rainforest Project. And Ella's going to speak about what next.
Yeah, so obviously, as the project is coming to a close, we don't want to lose the good works that we've started. We don't want any of that to stop. So it won't be ending here. After the LIFE project, partners in the rainforest zone in Eryri will be continuing to work on new landscape scale projects to secure more funding for ancient woodland restoration across this key landscape. The lessons learned from the LIFE project will help inform future projects, building on the successes and mitigating some of the challenges that have been uncovered through this process. We'll be looking to increase sector capacity, work with new and existing partners. We'll be continuing to survey woodlands across the landscape and bringing new sites into restoration, so I'm sure you'll hear much more about this in future.
Finally, we'll hear from Julia Harrison, Project Manager for the southern half of the LIFE Celtic Rainforests Project, who's based at the RSPB. Now, Julia has been involved with the project since it began in 2018 and has led work introducing conservation grazing into woodlands across Wales. In her presentation, she shares what the project has learnt about the role of grazing animals in woodland and reflects on a range of sites she has worked on throughout the project.
I also look after two actions, C5 and C6. You've heard a lot of these C numbers today. C5 is introducing grazing and C6 is woodland management. So I overlap there a little bit with the northern part of the project because I work on several woods within the Merioneth SAC. Both of these actions involve work in sites which are already pretty nice broadleaf woodland, but just need appropriate management to bring them into more favourable condition. The two actions complement each other because grazing is often there to follow woodland works. So if you're carrying out thinning works to allow sunlight to come down into the wood, these thin broadleaves are obviously going to regrow as coppice unless you introduce grazing to keep them down. The original KPIs were 227 hectares for introducing grazing and 130 hectares for woodland management. We've exceeded the target on both these actions with 297 hectares of woodland currently being grazed under the project and 183 hectares having woodland management works. We've also produced 6 case studies, most of which are already available on the Celtic Rainforest website in Welsh and English. And we've held a number of grazing and woodland management demonstration days, which were attended by 169 people. And so this slide shows the sites where we've worked on for these two actions. There are 8 up in Eryri, with a cluster of 6 around the Mawddach estuary area. There's 1 in Coed 7 in the Elan Valley, and 2 in Gronffindina, Stanley and Llandovery. So it's quite a wide area where we've been working. And then challenges. The difficulties around these grazing projects have been similar across all the different areas, with the main challenge being that it's just difficult to find someone who's willing to put his animals into your woodlands. People worry the animals won't do well in there, that there won't be enough forage for them or the right sort of forage, and they also worry that they might come to grief on the street terrain. There's often lots of rocks under the moss, and they worry their animals will slip and fall on that. And then there's also the biggest issue is liquoring. So usually, in terms of welfare, graziers have to look at their animals pretty much every day. And if you've got a massive woodland site, you've got lots of trees, you can't see your animals through the trees. The sites can be quite remote, so the grazier's got to travel there and then walk through the wood looking for his animals. So it's just really time consuming for the grazier. So we've been helping with that by giving no fence collars to our animals. So no fence is a system where the animal wears a collar, which allows you to put up a virtual fence. You just draw a little fence on an app on your phone. And that's obviously great in a woodland where winds can frequently blow trees down onto your fences or your walls or whatever. So it acts as a fence to contain them. But it almost more important for the woodland grazing that we've been doing. It helps you to find the animal, so it gives a little location for the animal. As long as there's mobile phone signal, the collar is constantly telling you where your animals are, and it means you can go straight to them. And obviously that cuts down on your time and effort. But they also measure, there's a part of it where they measure the animal's activity levels. So as the animal's moving through the wood, it measures it on your phone. You can see it's moving about, and if it's moving about quite healthily and up and at its normal rate, then it's probably all right. So it actually cuts down on the number of times you have to visit the site and look for your animals. But we do also have to put up fencing infrastructure, so that's the other big challenge. We've got to exclude sheep grazing, so we've got to put up sheep stock fencing in all our sites. These are like really steep, remote sites, and they're delicate triple SI woodlands. So the materials have to be carried in by hand, really heavy. Contractors carrying them on foot, and it's turned out it was a challenge in the beginning, but it's actually turned out to be less of a challenge than we thought it might, because it does turn out that there are a number of really superhuman fencing contractors here in Wales who are really happy to do it, and it's suddenly done in like a week, and you're like, wow. So for the next 2 slides, I'm just going to go into a bit more detail about a couple of sites we've worked on in the Malbac Estuary area, which is within the Eryri SAC. I thought I'd talk about 2 sites which at the beginning of the project had similar issues. Coed Geth is on the northern side of the estuary, and that's the one that we'll be going to as part of the grazing day on Wednesday, workshop thing, walk on Wednesday. And then Abergwyn and Eryri is on the southern side. Both of these woods were becoming really, really dense with regenerating trees, mainly birch. You can see all crowding up in the top right there. High understory of bramble, you can see there, and impenetrable holly thickets. And you can see there this glade this ride is quite shady and dark. So this was having a negative impact on many of the target species we're trying to protect. A dense wood with dense canopy cover. We've got little light coming in and hitting the forest floor, as people have explained. Lichens and bryophytes really need that to thrive. Also woodland birds like pied flycatcher, like an open structure to the woodland to give them space to hunt for insects. And lots of woodland birds and butterflies and things also benefit from woodland edgy type habitat. So the sunny glades and rides and things, that more open you can keep them, this can have a positive impact on biodiversity. So the plan was to carry out thinning works across these sites under Action C6, including halo thinning around the older oaks, thinning out the areas of dense holly, making some glades and rides, all to allow more light in and make this open structure that we're after. And we then thought that we were then going to follow this with grazing as a sustainable way to maintain these improvements. Obviously, it's too much work in terms of time and expense to get someone going in there with crush cutters and keeping it down. And then, of course, the grazier gets a product. So I feel that conservation grazing in woodlands like this and on other similar sites is probably the most ethical kind of meat you can eat. Often the first thing we needed to deal with is bramble. So, of course, if you're doing a lot of thinning and letting in light, the first thing that's going to happen is that there's going to be an explosion of the bramble, which is already taking up quite a lot of the forest floor on these sites. So the cattle are really great at dealing with that. As soon as we introduced them, they got to work on it. This is the picture on the left is the cattle going in to Coed Geth on their first day back in November 2019. You can see they're just enthusiastically getting tucked in straight away. And the photo on the right was taken in June 2023, and as you can see, it's not really come back. And there's a nice rocky feature there, all exposed, and rocky boulders and things on the forest floor, a valuable substrate for some of the rarer lichens and bryophytes. But bramble often overwhelms those features, and the cattle are really good at keeping them clear. Garth Geth was one of the first sites to get grazed. The cattle were introduced just before COVID in 2019. We started small with these 3 cattle that you see there, and we thought we'd soon need to increase. We thought we might need up to like 12 cattle, I think, on this site, which is 38 hectares. However, after the first 3 years, we realised that they're just doing a great job. There's the 3 of them. So we've maintained a really low stocking density in all our woodlands ever since. So another issue is that the woods were getting, well, the same issue I've just talked about, is that the woodlands were getting very dense. Here you can see that the cattle do actually help with that, in that when the saplings are quite small, they'll go in there and push them over. So this is quite a gribbin, and you can see that the cattle have been pushing over the saplings in these pictures. But when they get too numerous, so at the back of this picture, even though they've been pushing them over, they're not making enough of an impact. So we do thinning in these woods, the bigger ones that they can't push down, and then these smaller ones. And when they push these over, they don't always kill them as well. So that can make for sort of more interesting trees in later life with gnarly little bits that insects can get into. So yeah, really good habitat. Here in Coedgarth Geth, we needed to do more extensive thinning works because the regenerating trees, as you can see in the lower picture there, were quite big, and they'd already reached the size of the cattle wouldn't affect at all. And then the thickets of holly that you can see in the top picture were really dense. So we needed to get in there and do some thinning. We also did halo thinning, which is when you thin the majority of trees going around a larger, more mature tree, which you can see in the bottom picture. We've halo thinned around the trees at the back there. Many of the lichens, rarer lichens and bryophytes, like to sort of live on more horizontal, open-grown trees with horizontal branches. So just giving them room to breathe is like a worthwhile thing to do. And then after that, we introduced the cattle grazing, and you can see that they've kept on top of it in both pictures. So that big, dense holly patch hasn't come back, and then they've kept on top of all the coppice regrowth and just allowed a lot more biodiversity on the ground floor, as you can see from the sort of later pictures. Another issue is ivy. So like I say, some of the rarer lichens and bryophytes like to grow on the lower parts of trees, but they also like to grow on the bases of trees because these are more base rich, or at least less acidic than the upper parts of trees. The cattle are so good that all grazing animals love ivy, and they just get in there and eat it up just to expose just the right growing conditions for the lichens. In fact, you've got a conjecture that maybe the lichens and bryophytes are adapted to live there because it's quite often because it was historically kept open by animals. So yeah. Sometimes, though, you have a particular issue at a site that is difficult to crack. So this is a gribbin, and on a gribbin there are these, you can just see at the top left of the picture on the right, there are these really big Douglas fir, big stand of them, and we can't fell those Douglas fir. They're the seed source for all the Douglas spreading throughout the wood, and we can't fell them because they turn out to have really rare lichens growing on them. So we're just trying to get the cattle to eat it if we can. You can see that it's covering the floor underneath them, is really becoming a problem, but it's also spreading like little sporadic trees throughout the wood. But they do eat it because on this picture, they've eaten every single bit of the Douglas that's poking through that fence. And I think what happened there, what you can't just off the picture, it goes really steep just there. So I think a bunch of them sort of went in there, and then cattle struggled to do a 180 really easily. So I think they were in there a little while before they worked out how to turn around and come out, and they've eaten it. So we're thinking that if we put mineral licks, maybe spread some hay in that area and just encourage them to stay there, that hopefully they will do something about it eventually. But sometimes, yeah, you just have to get a bit creative. Ferns. All breeds of cattle seem to really love ferns. This can be a bit of a problem because obviously we don't want them to eat all the ferns. The picture on the left was taken in a gribbin, and the one on the right was taken after 3 years of summer grazing for 3 to 4 months over the summer. You can see that the holly in the back of the photo, that was thinned out, and they've kept really nicely on top of that. So they're doing their job in that sense, but they've also had a really big impact on these ferns. And this is the point where we kind of realised that it would be a good idea to switch to winter grazing for a while to give the ferns a chance to come back. And this just is kind of illustrates a point that I wanted to make about the need for ongoing input from someone with a sort of ecological overview of a site, because it doesn't seem to be possible just to get a grazing level and then leave it at that and it looks after itself. You do need to keep going in, monitoring it and making sure that you're getting the grazing levels right and there isn't something that's being adversely affected that you didn't want. Another thing to comment on with ferns is that the grazing animals love ferns, maybe for a really good reason. One of the things we found is that people who are grazing our sites don't have any problems with fluke or worms or parasites like that. And obviously, there's a big side of that is to do with it being really, really low intensity. They're obviously not passing over the same area, so they're not able to pick up the parasites over and over again. But then ferns are known to have, male ferns are known to have a vermicidal quality, and there's a few sort of plants that grow within woodlands that do have vermicidal properties, so that might be having a positive effect as well. So next I just wanted to present a slightly different case study where the woodland was replanted, so we're basically grazing in a regenerating woodland while it regenerates. This is the Elan Valley. I just kind of stuck this map in just to show how we've kind of taken over the Elan Valley that with all these different woodlands where we're working on. And Coed Llawn is the big red block towards the bottom of the screen. So Coed Llawn had been planted up under a Better Woodlands for Wales scheme, which expired in the early days of the project. So the trees were at least 10 years old when we started work on the site. There were lots of oak and broadleafs that had been planted, but due to trespass grazing from sheep, they were all really, really tiny and topiarised looking. So we first of all just went in there and put up stock fencing to exclude the sheep, but we immediately introduced beef shorthorn cattle, which we do sort of over winter and then on into spring when the grazier wants to put the animals up on the hill. Anecdotal evidence at the time suggested that beef shorthorns don't browse, that they just sort of graze on the grass and low down, and they don't tend to eat trees. And luckily for us, that did turn out to be true, because you can see on the bottom pictures there's a big upshoot of growth. This is the first 2 years since excluding the sheep, but still having the cattle in, and you can see the long shoots of the broadleafs growing up, and they just don't seem to be eating them. But quirkily, the one tree they do like to eat is Scots pine. You can see this Scots pine, they've eaten every little needle off of it, and this is like willow and various other broadleaf trees to the side, and they've just not touched any of it. So unfortunately, the Scots pine on this site are going to suffer. But yeah, for the most part, they're really doing their job in there. And then there's just another couple of pictures just to illustrate some less obvious advantages of grazing in woodlands. So that's a picture of a colony of fungi growing on some dung in Coed Llawn. You could have a whole slide about the benefits of dung in woodlands and the colonies of creatures that live in it. But yeah, it's really good for insects, really good therefore for birds. And yeah, a really positive thing. And then bottom right slide shows this pond that they made in Coed Llawn. There was an area that was like wet in the summer, just in the winter, just for like a short time and slightly into the spring. But it always dried up. It was always dry all summer. But somehow they preferred to drink there than the pasture pump that we gave them. And they've trampled it and somehow changed the soil structure. So now it's wet all year round, and it's a completely different habitat, and can support dragonflies and things. So yeah, it's just an example of them being ecosystem engineers, and that's happened at there are 3 different sites where they've done that, where they've made a pond that there wasn't one before. So what next? So with a thought on the future and post-life work, we hope that we've demonstrated through the project that the use of livestock can be a highly effective way of managing woodlands that not only benefits the woodlands condition, but also provides some economic returns to graziers in their high-quality, ethical products of meat. Arguably, grazing woodlands replicates what would have been natural processes, and it also replicates traditional historical farming practices with low-intensity woodland grazing taking place in the winter when the animals are brought down off the hill for shelter. We hope that for future projects, land management schemes and initiative in Wales, they can take what we've learned as part of the Celtic Rainforests Project and replicate it, so that conservation grazing just becomes a mainstream standard practice.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Eryri Podcast. If you'd like to learn more about the LIFE Celtic Rainforests Project, please visit our website Here you can explore our case studies, discover up-and-coming events and find out more about the work being carried out across Wales.